Vernon Joseph Baker was born on December 17, 1919, in Cheyenne, Wyoming. His early life reflected the racial inequalities that defined America in the early 20th century. After losing both parents at a young age, Baker and his sister were raised by their grandparents. His grandfather, Joseph S. Baker, a railroad worker, was a stern but guiding influence who taught him self-reliance and discipline. Despite living in the West, where racial segregation was less legally formalized than in the South, Baker still faced daily discrimination in education and employment. His determination to prove his worth despite those barriers became a defining aspect of his character. After graduating from high school in Clarinda, Iowa, Baker worked various jobs, including as a railroad porter and a hotel clerk. These were among the few positions available to black men in the 1930s, regardless of skill or ambition. In 1939, following his grandfather's death, Baker decided to pursue a career that could offer stability and purpose: the U.S. Army. However, his initial attempt to enlist was met with rejection. A white recruiter dismissed him with racial prejudice, claiming that the Army had no use for his kind. This rejection was not unusual. At that time, the U.S. Armed Forces maintained strict segregation policies that limited the roles of African Americans to service and labor units. Determined to serve, Baker tried again a year later, this time finding a recruiter willing to process his enlistment. He entered the Army in June 1941, just months before the United States would enter World War II. He was assigned to the 371st Infantry Regiment, a unit that would later form part of the all-black 92nd Infantry Division, known as the Buffalo Soldiers. The Army's segregation policies placed black soldiers in separate units under white officers, often relegating them to support duties rather than frontline combat. Nevertheless, Baker sought opportunities to prove his capability in every assignment. During basic training at Camp Walters, Texas, Baker quickly distinguished himself through his discipline and marksmanship. Despite demonstrating leadership potential, he was subjected to the same discriminatory environment faced by all black recruits. Training facilities were segregated, and black soldiers received outdated equipment, poor living conditions, and minimal recognition. White instructors often assumed that African American soldiers lacked the intelligence or courage for leadership roles. These systemic prejudices limited their access to specialized schools and officer training programs. Baker's perseverance caught the attention of a few fair-minded officers who recognized his abilities. In 1942, as the U.S. military expanded to meet wartime demands, limited opportunities for black soldiers to attend Officer Candidate School, OCS, opened up. Baker applied and was accepted to the Infantry OCS program at Fort Benning, Georgia, one of the first African Americans to do so during the war. The program was demanding, both academically and psychologically. Racial tensions ran high, and black candidates faced constant scrutiny. Any failure was used to justify existing racial biases. Baker endured frequent humiliation from white instructors who doubted his competence solely because of his race. Still, he graduated in 1943, earning his commission as a second lieutenant. Commissioned officers of color were rare in the segregated Army. At the time, fewer than 1% of Army officers were black. Baker's promotion represented both a personal triumph and a challenge. As an officer, he would lead men who shared his experiences of discrimination, but he would also report to white superiors who often questioned his authority. The Army maintained a racial hierarchy in which white officers commanded black units, and black officers were typically restricted to leading black enlisted men. Baker's position demanded exceptional skill and composure to gain respect and maintain unit discipline in the face of institutional racism. After OCS, Baker was assigned to the 375th Infantry Regiment at Camp Shelby, Mississippi. The 370th, composed almost entirely of black enlisted soldiers and junior officers, was commanded by white senior officers who often displayed open prejudice. Training schedules were poorly organized, equipment was scarce, and morale suffered under discriminatory treatment. Many of the division's officers had little faith in their black troops, assuming they were unfit for combat. These attitudes translated into poor tactical preparation and limited field experience before deployment. Baker sought to correct these deficiencies within his platoon. He emphasized rigorous discipline, marksmanship, and unit cohesion. His leadership style was direct and professional, earning the respect of his men even as he faced skepticism from superiors. Accounts from surviving members of the 92nd Division later confirmed that Baker's platoon maintained some of the highest readiness standards within the regiment. His actions demonstrated that performance, not race, determined military effectiveness, a concept still resisted by much of the Army's leadership at the time. In 1944, after extensive stateside training, the 92nd Infantry Division was deployed to Italy as part of the Fifth Army under General Mark Clark. The Italian campaign had become one of the most grueling theaters of World War II. Characterized by mountainous terrain, entrenched German defenses, and harsh weather, the 92nd was tasked with advancing along the Ligurian coast in northern Italy, where they would face experienced German units, including the Gothic Line defenders. Despite their assignment, the division's combat readiness was questioned by Allied command due to persistent racial biases. Many white officers assumed the black troops would break under pressure, an assumption that would be proven wrong by officers like Vernon Baker. Even before combat began, Baker confronted systemic discrimination that undermined unit performance. Black soldiers were frequently assigned menial tasks instead of combat missions, reinforcing a stereotype that they were unfit for frontline duty. Supplies, reinforcements, and intelligence were often delayed or withheld from black units. White replacement soldiers received preferential treatment in logistics and command assignments. Baker worked continuously to keep his men motivated and combat ready despite these obstacles. Baker's leadership was soon put to the test during combat patrols and small unit engagements in the Italian countryside. His platoon operated near the Arno River, conducting reconnaissance and eliminating isolated German outposts. Reports from the field showed that Baker's unit consistently carried out its objectives despite limited resources. His calm under fire and methodical approach to operations earned him a reputation among both subordinates and a few sympathetic white officers as a dependable leader. However, such performance was rarely acknowledged in official reports due to racial prejudice in the command structure. By late 1944, Baker had risen to the rank of first lieutenant. Within the segregated army, this was an uncommon achievement. He had proven that leadership and tactical skill were not bound by race, even though recognition was often denied to those who challenged the Army's discriminatory culture. His personal resilience mirrored that of many black soldiers who served with distinction despite facing systemic exclusion. Throughout this period, the broader political and military environment surrounding African American service began to shift. Civil rights organizations such as the NAACP and the Pittsburgh Courier launched campaigns demanding equality in the armed forces. Their Double V campaign, Victory Against Fascism Abroad and Racism at Home, placed national attention on the hypocrisy of fighting for freedom overseas while maintaining segregation in the military. These pressures, along with manpower shortages, gradually forced the Army to expand opportunities for black soldiers. Though full desegregation would not occur until 1948 under President Truman's Executive Order 9981. Within that climate, Baker's presence as a combat leader carried symbolic significance. He represented both the promise and the limitations of black advancement in the Army. While his competence earned him the loyalty of his men, his achievements were largely invisible to higher command. Reports from the 92nd Division frequently downplayed or ignored the performance of black officers. Despite these barriers, Baker's focus remained on mission success and the survival of his platoon. The training, discipline, and combat exposure that Baker gained through 1944 laid the foundation for his defining moment in April 1945, when his leadership would be tested in one of the most dangerous assaults of the Italian campaign. The segregation and prejudice that had shaped his early military experience forged a commander who was determined to prove the capability of black soldiers through direct action. His rise from a rejected recruit to a respected platoon leader exemplified the broader struggle of African Americans seeking equal recognition in the U.S. Armed Forces during World War II. Baker's path to leadership was neither simple nor supported by institutional encouragement. His commission and subsequent performance resulted from personal persistence rather than systemic reform. The segregated structure of the Army, combined with overt racism from white superiors, forced him to overcome challenges beyond the battlefield. Yet those very conditions hardened his resolve and prepared him for the high-stakes combat operations that would define his place in military history. By the time the 92nd Infantry Division prepared for its spring 1945 offensive, Baker had become one of the few black officers trusted to lead a frontline platoon in sustained combat. Every phase of his training, from rejection at the recruiting office to his eventual commission, reflected the tension between racial discrimination and individual merit that defined the experience of black soldiers in World War II. His development as a leader demonstrated that, even within a segregated and prejudiced system, competence and determination could not be entirely suppressed. Vernon Baker's emergence as an officer was not only a personal milestone, but also a critical step in the slow transformation of the U.S. Army. His experiences during training, his adaptation to a racially hostile environment, and his leadership in preparing men for battle in Italy marked the beginning of a combat career that would challenge long-standing stereotypes and ultimately reshape the narrative of African American contributions to World War II. By the time Vernon Baker completed his officer training and joined his unit in 1944, the 92nd Infantry Division had already become a central symbol of the U.S. Army's racial segregation policy during World War II. Known as the Buffalo Soldiers Division, the 92nd was the only African American infantry division to see sustained combat in the European theater. Its formation, structure, and eventual deployment reflected the contradictions of a military fighting for global freedom, while enforcing segregation within its own ranks. The 92nd Infantry Division was reactivated on October 15, 1942, at Fort Huachuca, Arizona. It had originally been established during World War I, but its reactivation for World War II was part of the War Department's decision to create all-black combat units under white command. The division's reestablishment was influenced by pressure from civil rights organizations, which argued that African Americans should be given the opportunity to serve in combat, rather than only in service or labor units. However, the Army's leadership remained reluctant to entrust black soldiers with significant battlefield roles, and the structure of the 92nd reflected that hesitation. The division was commanded by Major General Edward M. Almond, a career officer who held conventional views about race and military hierarchy. Almond's command decisions and attitudes toward his troops would later play a major role in shaping the division's performance and morale. Under him were three main infantry regiments: the 365th, 366th, and 370th, along with artillery, engineer, medical, and service units. Each regiment had both black enlisted men and junior officers, but most senior command positions were filled by white officers. This system created constant friction within the chain of command. Many of the white officers had little confidence in their black subordinates and were reluctant to delegate authority or trust field reports. Training at Fort Huachuca exposed the deep divisions within the Army's racial system. The base itself was segregated, with separate housing, recreational facilities, and even medical treatment areas. Black soldiers trained with outdated equipment, often using weapons and vehicles left over from earlier years. Training schedules were inconsistent, and instruction quality varied depending on the attitudes of individual officers. White units stationed nearby received priority in supplies, ammunition, and logistical support. Despite these disparities, many of the enlisted men and junior officers in the 92nd showed high morale and motivation. For most, it was their first opportunity to serve in combat, and they wanted to prove that African Americans could perform as effectively as any other soldiers. The division's transition from training to deployment began in the summer of 1944. After completing basic and advanced training, the 92nd Infantry Division was assigned to the U.S. Fifth Army under Lieutenant General Mark W. Clark. They were sent to the Mediterranean theater, specifically Italy, where Allied forces had been engaged in a slow and costly campaign to drive the Germans northward through rugged terrain and heavily fortified lines. By this point, the Allies had already captured Rome in June 1944, but were struggling to break through the Gothic Line, a complex series of German defensive positions stretching across northern Italy. The 92nd was tasked with joining this offensive along the western coastal sector between the Ligurian Sea and the Apennine Mountains. The division began arriving in Italy in late July 1944. They were assigned to relieve elements of the 1st Armored Division and British units operating near the town of Massa. The terrain in this region was extremely difficult for infantry operations. Steep hills, narrow valleys, and dense vegetation favored the defending German forces. Enemy positions were fortified with machine gun nests, minefields, and artillery emplacements. The 92nd Division's first major combat engagements occurred in the late summer and fall of 1944, as they participated in patrols, reconnaissance missions, and limited offensives designed to test German defenses. From the beginning of their deployment, the 92nd encountered problems rooted in the Army's discriminatory command structure. General Almond and several of his senior staff officers were skeptical of their troops' reliability. Reports and orders often reflected racial bias rather than objective assessments of battlefield performance. When operations failed, the blame was frequently placed on the division's black soldiers rather than on poor planning or inadequate support. This attitude had damaging effects on morale and unit cohesion. Despite these challenges, individual units within the 92nd performed with professionalism and courage. Vernon Baker's 375th Infantry Regiment, in particular, gained a reputation for discipline and effectiveness in small unit actions. The 370th was unique among the division's regiments because it had some of the most experienced African American officers and non-commissioned officers, many of whom had served in the interwar period. Their leadership helped offset the systemic problems imposed by the segregated structure. Other regiments, such as the 365th and 366th, suffered from inconsistent leadership and the replacement of capable black officers with inexperienced white ones. This pattern reflected the Army's reluctance to allow African Americans real command authority, even when evidence showed that they performed well. By late 1944, the division had become fully engaged in the campaign north of the Arno River. The 92nd participated in several local offensives aimed at capturing German outposts and securing high ground positions overlooking the Serchio Valley. These operations were often conducted under severe logistical constraints. The division received less artillery and air support compared to neighboring white divisions. Replacements and reinforcements were slow to arrive. Intelligence reports about enemy positions were often outdated or inaccurate. Despite these disadvantages, many patrols conducted by the 92nd successfully gathered critical information and engaged German troops in close combat. Racial tensions within the command structure intensified during the winter of 1944-45. As the weather deteriorated and the front line stabilized, morale across the division suffered. General Alman's leadership style, characterized by public criticism of his own men, further weakened confidence. He frequently issued reports blaming black troops for setbacks, while minimizing the effects of terrain, weather, and enemy strength. Some white officers under Alman's command shared his views and requested reassignment rather than continue serving in a black unit. This atmosphere created distrust between the ranks and leadership, undermining the division's effectiveness. In December 1944, the 92nd Division faced one of its most difficult moments when German forces launched a counteroffensive in the Serchio Valley. The attack caught parts of the division off guard, forcing temporary withdrawals from several positions. Almond and other senior commanders quickly attributed the setbacks to the supposed lack of combat reliability among black troops, ignoring the fact that the German forces had superior numbers, better artillery coordination, and full control of high ground. Investigations conducted later confirmed that the initial failures were due to poor intelligence and inadequate preparation, not cowardice or incompetence among the enlisted men. However, the official narrative at the time reinforced racial stereotypes, resulting in the relief of several black officers and the reassignment of black combat units to defensive or secondary roles. Vernon Baker and his platoon within the 375th Infantry Regiment continued to operate despite these setbacks. The regiment maintained a higher level of cohesion and discipline than other elements of the division, primarily due to stronger leadership at the company and platoon levels. Baker's men participated in continuous reconnaissance missions, capturing prisoners and identifying German strongpoints along the Ligurian coast. Their reports contributed valuable intelligence to the Fifth Army's planning. But recognition for these efforts rarely reached official channels due to persistent bias within division headquarters. By early 1945, Allied command began preparing for a final offensive to break the German defensive lines in northern Italy. The 92nd Division was assigned to advance along the western coastal sector toward the city of La Spezia. Despite its mixed reputation, the division still held vital ground and tied down significant German forces. Baker's regiment, the 371st, was tasked with attacking heavily fortified positions around the town of Massa and the surrounding hills. This mission would culminate in one of the most significant actions involving Black American soldiers during the entire Italian campaign. The operational challenges faced by the 92nd Infantry Division extended beyond the battlefield. Segregation affected every aspect of logistics, communication, and administration. Black soldiers were often excluded from strategic briefings, limiting their situational awareness. Medical evacuation systems prioritized white casualties, resulting in delays for wounded black soldiers. Supplies were inconsistently distributed, with white units receiving priority in food, ammunition, and winter clothing. Even within rear areas, racial segregation was strictly enforced. Black soldiers had separate recreation areas, mess halls, and quarters. Relations with Italian civilians were also complicated by racial prejudice imported from the American command structure. Some officers restricted black soldiers' contact with locals, fearing social interactions that violated racial norms of the era. Despite systemic discrimination, the 92nd Infantry Division's record demonstrated persistence and professionalism under extraordinarily difficult conditions. Official statistics show that the division suffered over 700 killed in action and nearly 4,000 wounded during its deployment in Italy. More than 12,000 decorations and citations were awarded to its members, including the Distinguished Service Crosses, Silver Stars, and Bronze Stars. These numbers indicated the division's active and sustained combat role, contradicting the narrative that black troops were unwilling or incapable fighters. The 92nd's mixed combat reputation, heavily influenced by biased reporting, led to lasting controversy within the U.S. military. After the war, several reviews were conducted to assess its performance. These reports consistently concluded that poor leadership at the senior level and systemic racism, rather than lack of ability among the enlisted men, were the main causes of operational difficulties. The findings later played a role in shaping post-war military reforms that eventually led to desegregation. For Vernon Baker, service within the 92nd Division provided the environment that would define his military legacy. The division's structure and the challenges it faced illustrated the institutional racism that permeated the Army. Yet it also offered him the opportunity to demonstrate leadership under pressure. His experiences within the 375th Infantry Regiment, operating under restrictive conditions and with limited support, set the stage for the events of April 1945, when his platoon would execute one of the most successful small unit actions of the Italian campaign. The 92nd Infantry Division's service in Italy stands as a factual record of how segregation directly affected combat efficiency, morale, and recognition. It was both a test of military effectiveness under discrimination and a demonstration of the capability of black soldiers to perform their duties with distinction, despite every institutional obstacle placed before them. By the spring of 1945, the 92nd Infantry Division was positioned for what would become its final major engagement of the Italian campaign. German forces of the 14th Army were still holding defensive positions along the western sector of the Gothic Line. A fortified belt of strong points, minefields, and concrete bunkers extending across northern Italy. The Allied command aimed to breach this line in a coordinated offensive that would force the remaining Axis troops to retreat toward the Po Valley. Within this strategic context, the 371st Infantry Regiment, including Vernon Baker's platoon, was assigned to clear enemy positions around the mountain stronghold, known as Castel Aghinolfi, near Viareggio. The assault, conducted on April 5th to 6th, 1945, became one of the most remarkable small unit actions carried out by American forces in Italy. Castel Aghinolfi, a medieval stone structure situated on a steep hill near the town of Montignoso, had been converted by the Germans into a defensive fortress. It overlooked Highway 1, a key route connecting the coastal area to the interior, and its elevation allowed German observers to direct artillery fire on Allied approaches. The area around the castle was reinforced with minefields, barbed wire, and interlocking machine gun positions. The 16th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, one of the most experienced German formations remaining in Italy, defended the position with approximately 200 men supported by heavy weapons. Capturing it required advancing uphill through exposed terrain with limited cover. The 370th Infantry Regiment received orders to seize the high ground around the castle as part of the larger 5th Army offensive. Lieutenant Vernon Baker, then leading a weapons platoon in Company C, was tasked with conducting a reconnaissance and assault operation to identify and neutralize German positions ahead of the main attack. His platoon consisted of about 25 men equipped with small arms, grenades, and light machine guns. The terrain was heavily mined, and enemy fire from concealed bunkers made movement extremely difficult. The operation began before dawn on April 5, 1945. Baker's unit advanced under cover of darkness, crossing a small creek and moving through a wooded area toward the German lines. At approximately 0530 hours, the platoon came under fire from a machine gun nest positioned near a stone wall. Without waiting for supporting fire, Baker maneuvered forward with one of his men and destroyed the position using hand grenades. Continuing the advance, he located a second machine gun emplacement. Approaching within 20 yards, he again used grenades and rifle fire to eliminate the crew. This pattern of close-quarters engagement continued throughout the morning as Baker personally led the assault against multiple fortified positions. As the platoon advanced further up the hill, they encountered a dug-in observation post connected to a bunker by a narrow trench. Baker crawled forward under enemy fire and threw a grenade into the opening, killing the occupants. Moving on, he identified another machine gun position camouflaged near a stone building. He and his men destroyed it using grenades and small arms fire. By this point, the platoon had suffered casualties, but Baker continued directing the attack. Over the course of several hours, he personally destroyed at least 3 machine gun nests, an observation post, and a dugout containing enemy soldiers. At approximately 1000 hours, Baker's platoon reached a small cluster of buildings near the base of the castle hill. German defenders opened fire with automatic weapons from upper-floor windows. Baker returned fire, entered the building, and cleared it room by room. In one of the rooms, he discovered a radio set and several German soldiers preparing to call in artillery support. He shot them before they could transmit. The platoon then secured the building and used it as a temporary command post. During this phase of the operation, Baker coordinated with other elements of Company C that were advancing on parallel routes. Communication was maintained through runners, as radio contact was unreliable in the mountainous terrain. At midday, the Germans launched a counterattack from higher ground, supported by mortar fire. Baker organized his men into defensive positions, returning fire with machine guns and rifles. The engagement lasted approximately 1 hour. When ammunition began to run low, Baker sent one of his men back to request resupply and reinforcements. However, higher command, misjudging the situation, ordered a withdrawal rather than reinforcement. Baker refused to retreat without securing the area, arguing that a pullback would expose other units to flanking fire. He held his ground until the counterattack subsided. As daylight faded, Baker continued to reconnoiter the surrounding area. He identified additional enemy bunkers higher up the slope and marked them for destruction during the next day's advance. Before withdrawing to reorganize, he personally covered the evacuation of his wounded men under sniper fire. His calm leadership and direct participation in combat ensured the survival of most of his platoon. On the night of April 5th, Baker reassembled his remaining men and prepared for renewed action. The following morning, April 6th, the main assault by the 375th Infantry Regiment resumed. Baker again led his platoon forward, directing supporting fire and coordinating movements between adjacent squads. As they approached the upper slopes near Castel Aghinolfi, they encountered intense resistance from entrenched German positions. Baker moved ahead of his unit to reconnoiter, locating an enemy observation post and another machine gun nest. Using grenades and his M1 rifle, he destroyed both. Shortly thereafter, he observed a German soldier attempting to man an abandoned gun. Baker shot him before he could open fire. During the assault, Baker's platoon inflicted heavy casualties on the defenders and captured several prisoners. His leadership ensured that the company maintained momentum despite strong opposition. Once the immediate objectives were secured, Baker supervised the consolidation of positions and reported the destruction of 6 enemy fortifications, including machine gun nests and bunkers. Later reports confirmed that his actions directly contributed to the overall success of the 375th Regiment's attack on the sector, enabling other units to advance toward the castle itself. The engagement at Castel Aghinolfi was part of a larger coordinated offensive involving multiple divisions. The Fifth Army's April 1945 push aimed to break through the Gothic line and open the route to the Po Valley. The 92nd Infantry Division's success in the western coastal area tied down German reserves, facilitating breakthroughs elsewhere. Although Baker's action represented only one platoon-level engagement, its tactical significance was considerable. The destruction of key German positions removed obstacles that had previously stalled Allied advances along Highway 1. Reports from the 370th Infantry Regiment following the battle highlighted Baker's leadership and courage. His commanding officers submitted recommendations for commendations based on eyewitness accounts. At the time, Baker received the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest U.S. Army decoration for valor. The citation credited him with personally eliminating numerous enemy positions and leading his men with exceptional effectiveness under fire. However, like many African American soldiers during World War II, his achievements did not receive broader recognition within the Army's segregated command structure. Many reports from the 92nd Division were filtered or minimized before reaching higher headquarters, reflecting the ongoing racial bias in documentation and awards. The assault on Castel Aghinolfi marked the culmination of the 92nd Infantry Division's combat operations. After the battle, the division continued its advance northward as German resistance in Italy collapsed. By late April 1945, Allied forces had broken through the Po Valley and forced the unconditional surrender of German forces in the theater. For Baker and his men, the final weeks of the campaign involved clearing isolated pockets of resistance and securing captured territory. The 370th Infantry Regiment maintained its combat effectiveness until the end of hostilities in May 1945. The tactical record of the Castel Aghinolfi engagement illustrates the effectiveness of small unit leadership within a broader context of structural discrimination. Despite limited resources and minimal support, Baker's platoon achieved results that surpassed expectations under adverse conditions. His actions demonstrated disciplined initiative, a trait often overlooked in assessments of black combat units during the war. Later reviews of the battle conducted by the U.S. Army Center of Military History confirmed that Baker's operation met the highest standards of tactical execution and personal bravery. After the war, historians analyzing the Italian campaign identified the battle as a critical demonstration of African American soldiers' combat capability. It challenged long-standing assumptions that had justified segregation in the armed forces. The detailed reports from Baker's company, including after-action documentation and statements from surviving officers, provided clear evidence of the leadership and efficiency displayed during the assault. These records later played a significant role in the 1990s review that re-evaluated decorations awarded to black soldiers in World War II. The operational details of the Castel Aghinolfi engagement remain a significant part of military history due to the clarity of its tactical outcomes. Baker's platoon neutralized multiple fortified positions, destroyed an estimated 20 enemy soldiers, and captured several prisoners with minimal casualties. Their success contributed directly to the 375th Regiment's ability to advance along its assigned sector. In recognition of these results, the regiment received commendations from higher command. Although many individual acts of valor, including Baker's, went unacknowledged at the time. The mission also exposed the continued challenges faced by black soldiers in gaining equal treatment and recognition. Despite verifiable success in combat, the 92nd Infantry Division continued to be regarded with skepticism by many white officers. Reports from General Alman's headquarters often downplayed the contributions of Baker's unit and attributed success to external support rather than to the leadership of black officers. This discrepancy between battlefield reality and official record-keeping highlighted the institutional barriers that persisted even after clear evidence of performance. In the months following the end of hostilities, Vernon Baker's wartime record remained largely confined to regimental archives. His Distinguished Service Cross was an acknowledgement of bravery, but did not fully represent the scale of his achievement. The broader historical importance of his actions would only be recognized decades later, when military historians and review boards revisited the combat records of African American soldiers from World War II. The battle for Castel Aghinolfi stands as a documented example of tactical excellence achieved under conditions of discrimination and limited resources. It demonstrated that leadership, discipline, and tactical skill could overcome entrenched prejudice and flawed command assumptions. Baker's actions on April 5 to 6, 1945, were not only instrumental in the success of his regiment, but also became evidence in the eventual re-evaluation of the role of black soldiers in the U.S. military. His conduct during the assault provided concrete proof of the professionalism and effectiveness of African American combat leaders during World War II. Following the capture of Castel Aghinolfi in April 1945, Vernon Baker's company continued combat operations in northern Italy until the German surrender the following month. The campaign concluded with the 92nd Infantry Division holding ground between the Ligurian coast and the Apennine foothills, securing the final German withdrawal routes. Baker's actions during the assault on April 5th to 6th were documented in company and regimental reports, noting his destruction of multiple enemy positions and leadership under fire. These records were clear, detailed, and supported by statements from fellow soldiers and officers. However, the Army's administrative system at the time operated under a structure that routinely minimized or ignored acts of valor by black soldiers. After-action reports from the 375th Infantry Regiment were reviewed at division headquarters, where the command staff, under Major General Edward Almond, was responsible for recommending awards. Almond's consistent skepticism toward the combat performance of black troops influenced how these reports were processed. Despite testimony confirming Baker's exceptional conduct, the recommendation for a high-level decoration faced delay and revision. The original recommendation from Baker's commanding officer suggested that his actions warranted the Medal of Honor, but division-level review downgraded it to a Distinguished Service Cross. This pattern was consistent with how the 92nd Infantry Division's combat performance was evaluated throughout the war. The Distinguished Service Cross citation issued to Baker on June 10, 1945, summarized his actions but omitted certain key details. It credited him with personally eliminating multiple enemy positions and maintaining command under heavy fire, but it failed to fully represent the scale of his leadership and the risks undertaken. At the time, no black soldiers serving in the Mediterranean theater received the Medal of Honor, despite several meeting the established criteria. Racial prejudice within the Army's awards and decorations system was a well-documented factor. Many recommendations for African American soldiers were either downgraded or rejected outright before reaching the Department of War. The 92nd Infantry Division, in particular, faced administrative neglect due to its controversial reputation among senior officers. General Almond's reports to higher command often emphasized the division's shortcomings while minimizing its successes. He attributed tactical victories to white officers and external support units rather than to the black soldiers who executed the missions. This bias extended to the review of valor awards. Commanders who distrusted the combat capability of black troops were unlikely to endorse recommendations for the Army's highest honors. As a result, only a small fraction of the 92nd Division soldiers received significant decorations despite verifiable records of bravery. Baker's Distinguished Service Cross was one of the highest awards issued to an African American soldier in the Italian campaign. However, the recognition process reflected broader systemic inequities. Black soldiers in World War II were subject to a segregated administrative framework that limited their access to fair evaluation. Reports were often filtered through officers who held racially biased views, and documentation from black units was frequently delayed or lost in the process of transmission between commands. Statistical data from the War Department later confirmed that African Americans represented about 10% of the Army's total strength during the war, but received less than 2% of its highest combat decorations. After the war ended in Europe in May 1945, Baker remained with the occupation forces in Italy before being reassigned to stateside duty. Like many veterans of the 92nd Infantry Division, he returned to an environment where military segregation and racial discrimination remained intact. When he returned to the United States in 1946, he found that his Distinguished Service Cross, while prestigious, did not grant him the same respect or opportunities that white officers with similar records received. The post-war Army still operated under a segregated system, and African American veterans were often excluded from career advancement or re-enlistment opportunities in leadership roles. In the years immediately following the war, little public attention was given to the contributions of black soldiers in the Italian campaign. Official histories published by the U.S. Army highlighted major operations, but largely omitted references to the 92nd Infantry Division's role. This omission reflected both the racial attitudes of the time and the influence of senior officers who had shaped the division's wartime narrative. Reports written by General Almond and others portrayed the 92nd as a unit that underperformed, ignoring the successful operations carried out by individual companies and platoons. Baker's platoon actions at Castel Aghinolfi were briefly mentioned in official records, but not emphasized in broader analyses of the campaign. During the post-war years, Baker continued his military service in a limited capacity. Despite the challenges faced by black officers, he re-enlisted and served as a commissioned officer in the newly reorganized U.S. Army. The desegregation of the armed forces did not occur until 1948, following President Harry S. Truman's Executive Order 9981, which officially ended racial segregation in the military. This policy change came too late to affect the wartime experiences of Baker and his peers, but opened opportunities for future generations. Baker's decision to remain in service reflected his commitment to professional military duty despite the injustices he had endured. While Baker's personal record remained intact, broader recognition for African American valor in World War II was slow to develop. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, military historians and civil rights advocates began to question the racial disparities in awards distribution. Studies revealed that numerous black soldiers had been recommended for high honors, but never received them due to discriminatory review processes. The Army's internal reports acknowledged that recommendations from segregated units were often dismissed at division or corps level before reaching final review. These findings eventually prompted congressional inquiries and pressure for historical reassessment. By the 1970s, interest in correcting the historical record grew. The U.S. Army commissioned several studies to re-examine the treatment of minority soldiers during World War II, including the work of the 92nd Infantry Division. These studies confirmed that acts of heroism by black soldiers had been systematically underreported or misrepresented. The archival review process uncovered documentation of Baker's 1945 actions that had not been properly considered for the Medal of Honor. Records from his regiment detailed his destruction of enemy fortifications, leadership in continuous combat, and the survival of his platoon under extreme conditions. The original recommendation files supported the argument that his Distinguished Service Cross should have been upgraded. In 1993, the U.S. Army commissioned Shaw University to conduct an independent study on racial disparities in the awarding of the Medal of Honor during World War II. The study reviewed over 1,200 case files involving African American soldiers. Researchers concluded that systemic racial discrimination had prevented black soldiers from receiving the nation's highest military honor. Among the cases examined was that of Vernon J. Baker. The review confirmed that his original actions met all the criteria required for the Medal of Honor, and that his that his award had been downgraded because of racial bias within the chain of command. Based on the findings of the Shaw University study, the Army Board for Correction of Military Records formally recommended that Vernon Baker's Distinguished Service Cross be upgraded. The Department of Defense and the White House reviewed the recommendation. And in 1997, more than 50 years after the events in Italy, the U.S. government corrected the historical record. On January 13, 1997, President Bill Clinton presented the Medal of Honor to Vernon Baker in a ceremony at the White House. He was the only living African-American World War II veteran among the 7 recipients recognized that day. The remaining 6 were honored posthumously. The 1997 Medal of Honor citation detailed Baker's actions during the assault near Viareggio, Italy, emphasizing his leadership, tactical judgment, and personal courage under direct fire. It described how he destroyed enemy positions, coordinated his men under heavy resistance, and refused to retreat despite overwhelming odds. The correction of the record was the result of extensive documentation and testimony, not reinterpretation. The review process demonstrated that the facts of Baker's conduct had always been known, but had been suppressed or ignored due to institutional discrimination within the Army's wartime administration. The delay in recognition highlighted the structural issues that affected black soldiers throughout World War II. Military historians later identified 3 main factors contributing to this systemic neglect. First, the segregated command structure limited black officers' influence over recommendations and documentation. Second, racial prejudice at division and corps levels led to the consistent downgrading of award submissions from black units. Third, the post-war debriefing and archival process failed to prioritize African American contributions, resulting in decades of incomplete records. Baker's experience represented a clear example of how these factors combined to deny proper recognition for heroism. The long delay also reflected broader societal patterns of exclusion in post-war America. Despite their service, many African American veterans returned to a country that offered limited employment, housing, and educational opportunities due to segregation and discriminatory laws. The lack of official recognition reinforced a perception that their sacrifices were undervalued. Baker's eventual acknowledgement in 1997 became a symbolic correction, not only for him, but for thousands of black soldiers whose actions went unrecognized. In the years following the Medal of Honor ceremony, Baker's case became a central reference point in discussions about racial inequality in the U.S. military. His recognition, though delayed, validated the historical record of the 92nd Infantry Division and countered decades of inaccurate assessments. The archival findings demonstrated that the division's combat record, long criticized by commanders such as General Almond, had included numerous acts of courage that were ignored due to systemic bias. The process of correcting these injustices required more than a symbolic award. It involved a reevaluation of how the U.S. Army documented and interpreted the service of minority soldiers. Following Baker's recognition, the Department of Defense instituted reforms to ensure that award recommendations were reviewed without racial bias. Subsequent military history publications incorporated revised accounts of the 92nd Infantry Division's actions, citing Baker's leadership as a documented example of effective combat command under segregation. The history of Baker's delayed recognition is not only a record of individual achievement, but also an example of how institutional discrimination shaped the narrative of World War II heroism. His case demonstrated that acts of valor could be ignored for decades despite clear evidence, and that correcting the record required deliberate institutional review. The acknowledgement of his heroism in 1997 served as a formal admission by the U.S. government that racial prejudice had distorted the historical understanding of the war. Vernon Baker's award correction did not change the outcome of the battle he fought or the experiences he endured. but it permanently altered how the U.S. military recognized the contributions of African American soldiers. The process that led to his Medal of Honor exposed the extent of bias in the wartime recognition system and established a precedent for historical accountability within the armed forces. The formal recognition of Vernon Baker's heroism in 1997 marked the culmination of an extensive institutional review that began in the early 1990s. The U.S. Army's decision to re-examine its World War II award system stemmed from growing evidence of racial disparities in combat recognition. Historians, veterans organizations, and civil rights advocates had repeatedly presented documentation showing that Black soldiers' records had been systematically devalued or ignored. The Army commissioned a comprehensive study in 1993 to determine whether racial discrimination had influenced decisions regarding the Medal of Honor and other top awards. The study was contracted to Shaw University, a historically Black college with expertise in African American military history. Researchers were granted access to wartime personnel files, unit records, and citation documentation housed at the National Archives and the Army's Military Awards branch. The objective was to identify cases in which African American soldiers had been nominated for the Medal of Honor, or had received lower awards despite performing actions consistent with Medal of Honor criteria. Each case was reviewed according to contemporary wartime standards, including eyewitness accounts, command endorsements, and official action reports. Out of more than 1,200 reviewed files, the Shaw University team identified several cases that demonstrated clear evidence of discrimination in award recommendations. These included soldiers from the 92nd Infantry Division, the 761st Tank Battalion, and other segregated units that had served in both the European and Pacific theaters. The study's findings concluded that racial bias had directly influenced the downgrading of awards for acts of heroism performed by Black soldiers during World War II. The results were formally presented to the Department of Defense and the U.S. Army's Board for Correction of Military Records in 1996. Among the cases reviewed, Vernon Baker's stood out for the strength of its documentation. His 1945 Distinguished Service Cross citation and supporting unit reports clearly described actions that met or exceeded the Medal of Honor's established standards for extraordinary heroism. Eyewitness accounts verified his leadership during the assault near Viareggio, Italy, and confirmed that his platoon had advanced under his direction despite losing most of its personnel. The study determined that Baker's award had been downgraded because of racial bias within the 92nd Division's command hierarchy. The recommendation for an upgrade was unanimously supported by the review committee. Following the study, the U.S. Army submitted its findings to the Department of Defense for official approval. The department's internal review confirmed that the wartime discrimination identified in the Shaw University report warranted corrective action. After consideration by the Secretary of the Army and the Secretary of Defense, the final list of recommended Medal of Honor recipients included 7 African American soldiers whose wartime acts had been misclassified or overlooked. Vernon Baker was the only one still living when the decision was made. The White House scheduled the Medal of Honor presentation for January 13, 1997. President Bill Clinton presided over the ceremony, which was held in the East Room with senior military officials, family members of the posthumous recipients, and representatives of veterans organizations in attendance. Baker, then 77 years old, received the Medal of Honor on behalf of himself and the 6 soldiers who had been recognized posthumously. The ceremony represented the U.S. government's formal acknowledgement of the racial injustice that had shaped award decisions during World War II. The Medal of Honor citation, read during the ceremony, outlined Baker's actions during the night of April 5 to 6, 1945, near Viareggio, Italy. It documented how he led his platoon through enemy minefields, destroyed multiple machine gun positions, and eliminated fortified bunkers under heavy enemy fire. It emphasized that his actions were instrumental in the company's success and demonstrated the highest standards of military valor. The citation was based entirely on wartime reports and did not reinterpret or embellish existing documentation, affirming the historical accuracy of the record. The 1997 recognition also brought renewed attention to the broader history of the 92nd Infantry Division. For decades, the division's combat record had been unfairly criticized by wartime commanders and post-war analysts who overlooked the operational difficulties imposed by segregation, inadequate training, and inconsistent leadership. The Medal of Honor awarded to Baker directly challenged these earlier assessments. It established that individual acts of exceptional courage had taken place within the division despite the institutional barriers imposed on its soldiers. Following the ceremony, the Department of Defense directed that the findings of the Shaw University study be preserved as part of the official military historical record. This included detailed documentation of each case and a formal acknowledgement that systemic discrimination had influenced awards policy during World War II. The Army also revised its awards review procedures to prevent similar disparities in the future. These reforms required that all recommendations for valor awards undergo an equal opportunity assessment to ensure impartial evaluation. The public acknowledgement of Baker's heroism contributed to a re-evaluation of how African American military service was represented in U.S. history. The late 1990s saw a series of initiatives aimed at correcting the record of minority participation in World War II. Military museums, including the U.S. Army Center of Military History and the Smithsonian Institution, updated exhibits to include the stories of Black soldiers who had served in segregated units. Educational programs emphasized the connection between military service and the broader civil rights movement, showing how the experiences of soldiers like Baker contributed to demands for equality after the war. Baker's recognition also had a significant impact on the perception of the 92nd Infantry Division. Historians revisited the division's official reports and discovered discrepancies between battlefield results and the negative evaluations issued by senior commanders. Subsequent analyses demonstrated that many of the division's operational setbacks were the result of poor planning, inconsistent leadership, and systemic prejudice, rather than the performance of the Black soldiers themselves. Baker's Medal of Honor validated the division's combat contribution and re-established its place within the narrative of the Italian campaign. After receiving the Medal of Honor, Vernon Baker became an active participant in military and educational programs that addressed the legacy of segregation in the armed forces. He spoke publicly about the challenges faced by Black soldiers during World War II and emphasized the importance of historical accuracy in documenting their contributions. His testimony provided first-hand insight into the realities of segregation, unequal treatment, and the persistence required to serve honorably despite discrimination. Baker's accounts were used in military training programs to illustrate the evolution of racial integration and leadership ethics within the Army. In addition to his public role, Baker continued to be involved in veterans organizations dedicated to preserving the memory of the 92nd Infantry Division. His efforts helped ensure that the division's history was properly recorded in official publications and memorials. The U.S. Army and several historical societies began to compile comprehensive records of the division's actions in Italy, including newly verified combat reports and award citations. These documents corrected decades of omissions and provided an accurate record of the division's role in the Allied campaign. Baker's legacy extended beyond the scope of his personal achievements. His Medal of Honor served as a precedent for subsequent reviews of minority recognition in U.S. military history. Following the 1997 ceremony, similar studies were conducted for other minority groups, including Asian American, Hispanic, and Native American soldiers whose awards had been subject to discrimination. The process established a permanent mechanism within the Department of Defense for re-evaluating past award decisions based on documented evidence of bias. The U.S. Army's institutional reforms following the 1997 review marked a significant shift in how military valor was evaluated and commemorated. By publicly acknowledging that racial prejudice had affected its highest honors, the Army set a historical benchmark for accountability. The publication of the African American Medal of Honor Recipients Report in 1998 consolidated the findings of the Shaw University study and officially documented the cases of the 7 soldiers recognized that year. The report became a foundational source for military historians and policy analysts examining the impact of segregation on award systems. Baker's recognition also influenced cultural representations of African American soldiers in film, literature, and museum exhibitions. His story was included in several documentaries on World War II, including those produced by the U.S. Army and public television networks. These works helped integrate his name into mainstream narratives of wartime heroism, ensuring that future generations of Americans understood both his courage and the systemic barriers he overcame. The final years of Baker's life reflected the long-term impact of his service and recognition. After retiring from the Army, he lived in St. Mary's, Idaho, maintaining close ties to the military community. He continued to speak publicly about military history and the importance of equal opportunity within the armed forces. In 2008, he was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. His burial site became part of the Medal of Honor memorials that document the service of decorated soldiers from all racial and ethnic backgrounds. The long-delayed recognition of Vernon Baker's actions symbolizes the intersection between military history and civil rights. His Medal of Honor did not only represent personal valor, it served as evidence of how the U.S. military evolved from an institution that tolerated segregation to one that formally acknowledged and corrected its past injustices. His case demonstrated that historical truth could be restored through meticulous documentation and institutional review. The re-examination of Baker's record and the eventual correction of his award had a measurable effect on U.S. military policy and historical scholarship. It validated the experiences of countless African American veterans whose contributions had been undervalued. The Army's public acknowledgement of discrimination in award procedures contributed to a broader national understanding of how racial inequality shaped wartime institutions. This recognition reinforced the idea that historical accountability is essential to maintaining integrity in national memory. By the early 2000s, Baker's name was permanently recorded in Army educational materials, museum exhibits, and Medal of Honor archives. His actions at Castel Aghinolfi became part of leadership training curricula at military academies, where they were studied as examples of tactical initiative, composure under fire, and ethical command in the face of adversity. The integration of his case into official military instruction demonstrated how individual acts of courage could influence institutional learning and reform. Vernon Baker's story remains a verified historical account of a soldier who performed beyond expectation, was denied recognition due to racial bias, and eventually received the nation's highest honor through deliberate review and correction. His legacy represents both the struggle and progress of the U.S. Army in addressing its past. The Medal of Honor, awarded to him in 1997, stands as a formal acknowledgement of truth restored. A recognition based on documented evidence, institutional accountability, and a commitment to historical accuracy that continues to shape the way military valor is understood and honored.